December 1979. Kabul, Afghanistan. One man sat inside the Taj Beg Palace while an elite military force surrounded the perimeter. He was the president. He watched the horizon and waited. There would be no negotiations and no escape. He knew the end was coming. Within hours, the palace walls would be breached. He would not die in a random crossfire. He would be executed by the invading army. His body would be dragged through the dirt and desecrated. This single death signaled a new, brutal era for the region. Who was this leader? Why did his own allies turn into his executioners? The consequences of this night would echo through the Cold War for a decade. At first glance, a local coup, but in reality, a global shift in power. To understand the execution, we must look at Afghanistan in the 1970s. The country was a fracture point between tradition and modernity. Regional powers fought for influence over the mountain passes. For decades, a monarchy provided a fragile stability. The king kept a balance between tribal leaders and the cities. But in Afghanistan, stability is temporary. 1973, the king was in Italy for eye surgery. His cousin, Mohammed Daoud Khan, saw an opportunity. He launched a bloodless coup and seized the throne. He abolished the monarchy and declared Afghanistan a republic. The frame shows the old king remained in exile and a new elite took control of Kabul. Daoud Khan wanted a modern state. He began building factories and paving roads. He drafted laws to move the country toward progressive social policies. He stripped power from religious authorities. In his office, he balanced two folders, one for the Soviet Union and one for the West. Geography forced him toward Moscow, but he tried to maintain his independence. The footage from this era shows Kabul looking like a European city, women in skirts, men in suits, secular schools opening in the provinces. But this was only the beginning of the friction. Resistance grew in the shadows. Conservative clerics viewed the reforms as an attack on Islam. They saw the new republic as a puppet of godless ideologies. Inside the military, officers began to divide into secret factions. Some wanted more religion, others wanted pure Soviet communism. The sound of dissent became a roar. Plotting replaced governance. Daoud Khan had ended the monarchy, but he had opened the door to chaos. April 1978. The streets of Kabul filled with tanks. Daoud Khan's time had run out. The era of the Republic ended in a hail of gunfire, setting the stage for the palace execution of 1979. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. April 27, 1978. The Afghan military turns its guns on the presidential palace. Officers from the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan lead the assault. They are communists. They have the full backing of the Soviet Union. How did the reign of Daoud Khan end? It ended in a bloodbath. He did not surrender. He grabbed a weapon and defended the palace halls. The soldiers shot him dead. They did not stop there. His entire family was gathered and executed on the spot. It was a cold calculation. No heirs meant no chance of a royal restoration. The new communist regime seized control immediately. They announced a radical transformation of the nation. They wanted to drag Afghanistan into the modern era by force. The party began its work. They passed laws to expand women's rights. They tried to overhaul the agricultural system. They built new schools and launched literacy campaigns. Most importantly, they attacked religious authority. They wanted a secular state. But these reforms hit a wall. Afghanistan was deeply religious and traditional. The rural population saw these changes as an attack on their way of life. At first glance, the reforms were progressive, but in reality, they were a declaration of war against the people. Peasants refused to hand over their land for collectivization. Islamic scholars declared the regime un-Islamic. In the mountains and the valleys, armed resistance began to organize. Within months, the countryside was in open rebellion. The government struggled. Nur Muhammad Taraki took power, followed by Hafizullah Amin. Neither could stop the insurgency. They relied entirely on Moscow. Soviet advisors sat in every government office. Soviet generals trained the Afghan army. Moscow sent the money and the guns. By late 1979, the situation reached a breaking point. The insurgency was winning. The United States and Western powers began funneling support to the resistance fighters. The Kremlin panicked. If Kabul fell, Soviet influence in Central Asia would vanish. The Soviet leadership faced a choice. They decided on direct intervention, December 24, 1979. Operation Storm 333 begins. Soviet tanks roll across the border. Airborne divisions drop into Kabul. The official reason was to save the communist government, but there was a hidden objective. The Soviets hated Hafizullah Amin. They viewed him as unstable and paranoid. The KGB suspected he was losing his mind, or worse, talking to the Americans. He was a liability. The Kremlin had a replacement ready, Babrak Karmal. He was a loyalist living in exile in the Soviet Union. He was predictable. He was a man who would follow Moscow's orders without question. The plan was simple. Eliminate Amin, install Karmal, secure the country. The invasion was not a rescue mission. It was a coup within a coup. The Soviet military moved to decapitate the very government they claimed to be protecting. Thus began a decade of war, December 27, 1979. On this day, the Soviet Union decided that Hafizullah Amin was no longer an ally, but a target. The order was clear: execution. Why did the Kremlin turn on their own man? Moscow viewed Amin as a liability and a potential traitor. A permanent solution was required. 7 in the evening, Soviet airborne troops dropped into Kabul under the cover of darkness. Their primary objective was the Taj Beg Palace. This was a fortified structure built on a hill, surrounded by minefields and heavy machine gun nests. Amin was inside with his family and his elite personal security detail. The sound of heavy engines filled the air. Amin heard the explosions and the rattling of tracks. He realized the truth instantly. The Soviet forces were not arriving to reinforce his regime. They were there to end it. Amin prepared for a final stand. He checked his weapons. He moved to his communication console to rally his supporters across the country. But the lines were dead. He was trapped in a stone fortress, cut off from the world. Outside, the Soviet Spetsnaz and paratroopers moved in silence. The assault was clinical. Soviet tanks and armored vehicles opened fire, systematically smashing the palace walls. High-caliber rounds tore through the windows. The Soviet forces attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, using grenades and automatic fire to clear the corridors. The palace guards fought back. They used submachine guns and barricaded the stairwells, but the numbers were against them. The Soviet attackers moved room by room. The footage from the aftermath shows smoke rising from the shattered facade. How did Amin spend his final moments? Witnesses claim he was found in his quarters. In the violence of the assault, Hafizullah Amin was killed. At first glance, he died in the crossfire, but in reality, the details remain a state secret. Some military reports state he was shot during the breach. Other witnesses claim he was captured alive and executed on the spot. The Soviet government suppressed the specifics. They controlled every camera and every telegram leaving Kabul. One fact is undisputed. By the end of the night, Amin was dead. Soviet soldiers dragged his body out of the palace. There was no funeral. There was no headstone. The Soviets disposed of the remains in an unmarked location to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for the resistance. The era of Amin was over, but this was only the beginning. To understand why the Soviets risked an international scandal, one must look at Amin's history. He was born in 1929. He was a Pashtun, educated first in Kabul and later in the United States. He walked the halls of Columbia University in New York. In the 1950s, Amin lived the American life. He studied mathematics. He observed Western democracy firsthand. This American connection made Moscow deeply suspicious. They feared he was a CIA asset hidden behind a communist mask. Amin returned to Afghanistan and climbed the ranks of the People's Democratic Party. He was a hardliner. He was a man of action. In April 1978, he helped lead the bloody communist coup that seized the capital. The revolution had begun. It ended in a palace cellar. 1979. Hafizullah Amin climbed to the peak of Afghan politics. He secured the titles of Deputy Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, and finally President. He held the country in a dual grip. Amin wanted to rewrite the foundations of the nation. He moved fast. He pushed for modernization and expanded rights for women. At the same time, he seized control of the land. He ordered the collectivization of agriculture and brought the entire economy under state command. He took direct aim at the mosques. He stripped power from religious authorities and marginalized Islamic institutions. The reaction was immediate. Why did the people turn against him? Amin ignored 1,000 years of tradition. Peasants refused to hand over their crops. Clerics declared the government an enemy of God. In the hills, the first sparks of armed insurgency appeared. By the end of the year, the fire spread. Huge sections of the country were in open revolt against the communist flag. As the supreme leader, Amin took charge of the crackdown. He used iron and blood. The state machinery began a cycle of arrests, systematic torture, and mass executions. The camera records the result: empty villages and mass graves. It is unclear if Amin signed every execution order himself, but he sat at the top of the pyramid. The repression backfired. Every death created 10 new rebels. Families of the tortured joined the insurgency for revenge. Neutral tribes took up arms just to survive the government's reach. Events accelerated. By December, the regime was suffocating. Amin controlled Kabul and a few urban hubs. The rest of the map belonged to the insurgents. The Afghan army was melting away as soldiers deserted by the thousands. The government was minutes away from total collapse. The Soviet Union watched from the north. They saw a failing puppet. They decided to intervene with direct force. The assault on Taj Beg Palace ended in Amin's death. Immediately, Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Kabul. They seized the ministries, they occupied the radio stations, they locked down the military bases. The city was under foreign boots. Babrak Karmal was their chosen replacement. The Soviets flew him into the capital under heavy guard. On December 25, 1979, Karmal's voice came over the airwaves. He announced he was the new leader. He blamed the dead Amin for every crime and every mistake. Karmal told a lie to the world. He claimed the Soviet military was there at the invitation of the Afghan government. He said they were there to protect the revolution from foreign interference. The reality was different. Amin never asked for the invasion. He was executed by the very soldiers who claimed to be his allies. Thus began a decade of war. December 27, 1979. The Soviet Union claimed its intervention was defensive. They argued they were protecting Afghanistan from foreign interference. The reality was different. The Soviets themselves were the foreign interveners. Why did Moscow push this narrative? It was a political necessity. The Soviet leadership and the international communist movement needed a veneer of legitimacy. They framed the invasion as a response to a formal request from the Afghan government. This allowed them to portray the move as support for self-determination. They wanted to avoid the label of imperial conquerors. Babrak Karmal took power. He attempted to project a moderate image. He was less repressive than his predecessor, Hafizullah Amin. Karmal made specific promises. He pledged to respect Islamic values. He vowed to address peasant grievances regarding land reform. He promised to roll back the most brutal policies of the previous regime. At first glance, a new era of reform. But in reality, nothing changed. Afghanistan was now under total Soviet military occupation. Soviet forces seized control of all major cities. They secured every primary line of communication. Soviet commanders held the real military authority. The Afghan government was a shell. Every minister was subordinate to a Soviet political advisor. Afghanistan had become a Soviet colony. The Afghan population did not wait. Their response was immediate and hostile. Karmal's promises failed to mask the presence of foreign tanks. The insurgency had already begun under Amin. Now it accelerated. Resistance groups known as the Mujahideen intensified their operations. The footage from this era shows scattered groups of armed men in the mountains. Some followed Islamic fundamentalism. Others fought for Afghan nationalism or tribal identity. Only one factor united them. They all wanted the Soviet military gone. The United States saw an opportunity. Washington moved to strike at Soviet influence. They began shipping military hardware to the resistance. Other Western-aligned nations joined the effort. Pakistan became the primary conduit. Money and weapons flowed across the southern border. The Americans provided advanced anti-aircraft missiles. The balance of power began to shift. There was no turning back. The execution of Hafizullah Amin was the turning point. It held two levels of significance. First, it ended any hope of an independent Afghan communist path. Amin tried to implement his own vision of communism. He failed to show total deference to Moscow. The Soviets decided they could not tolerate a leader they did not fully own. By killing Amin and installing Karmal, they ensured the leadership was entirely subordinate. Second, the execution signaled a massive military commitment. The Soviet Union was now locked into a conflict that would eventually involve hundreds of thousands of troops. The occupation would drag on for over a decade. The human cost was staggering. The war eventually killed more than 1 million Afghan civilians. More than 100,000 Soviet soldiers would return home in zinc coffins. Thus ended the first phase of the invasion. 100,000 Soviet soldiers. This massive force crossed the border and triggered a conflict that consumed every available resource. Money, fuel, and military hardware were diverted from the crumbling Soviet economy. The intervention soon turned into a domestic nightmare. Ordinary citizens grew restless. Mothers began receiving coffins. The decision to invade and execute Amin was a turning point with massive consequences. It was not just a crisis for Afghanistan, it was a death sentence for the Soviet Union. This military adventure led to total economic exhaustion. Why did the Kremlin take such a risk? They believed in a quick victory. But the reality was a decade of attrition. The execution of Amin happened as the Cold War changed direction. In the late 1970s, the superpowers practiced détente. This was a period of stability and formal negotiations. The invasion of Afghanistan destroyed that balance. It signaled a shift back toward direct confrontation. The United States reacted immediately. Washington increased military aid to anti-Soviet groups across the globe. President Jimmy Carter initiated a massive rearmament program. When Ronald Reagan took office, the military buildup accelerated even faster. The footage shows tanks rolling through mountain passes, the camera records, Carter signing sanctions into law. Détente was dead. The invasion marked the beginning of a new, more dangerous era of the Cold War. This period defined the entire 1980s. Amin's death also sent a message to the world. He was killed by the very power that claimed to support him. It was a brutal demonstration of Soviet logic. The Kremlin was willing to use lethal force to keep client states in line. The signal to other leaders was clear. If you lose Soviet approval, you lose your life. If you assert independence, you will be replaced. A cold atmosphere took hold. Fear and coercion reinforced Soviet dominance over its neighbors. But control on paper did not mean peace on the ground. What happened after the palace fell? Chaos followed the bullets. In the months after the execution of Hafizullah Amin, the country transformed. Afghanistan descended into warfare on an unprecedented scale. The era of stability was over. December 1979. The Soviet Union moved its divisions across the border. They expected a quick victory. Instead, they walked into a trap of fierce, decentralized resistance. The Mujahideen emerged as the primary opposition. They were not a single army. There was no central command. The resistance consisted of dozens of independent factions. They were divided by ethnic lines, religious interpretations, and political goals. Pashtuns, Tajiks, and Hazaras fought in their own territories. Some groups pushed for Islamic fundamentalism, others fought for Afghan nationalism. Only one thing united them: the presence of the Soviet military. Washington watched the invasion. American leadership viewed the move as an act of naked Soviet aggression. They decided to act. The United States and its allies launched a massive military aid program. This was not just a diplomatic statement, it was a shipment of hardware. They sent rifles, they sent ammunition. They provided training and millions of dollars in cold cash. The CIA took the lead. Operatives established a base of operations in Pakistan. They worked directly with Pakistani intelligence to funnel resources across the border. The goal was simple: Make the occupation as expensive as possible for Moscow. One weapon changed everything: the Stinger missile. Before these portable anti-aircraft systems arrived, Soviet gunships ruled the sky. The Mujahideen were defenseless against air attacks. Then, the balance shifted. Afghan fighters could now shoot down Mi-24 helicopters from the ground. Soviet pilots lost their sense of safety. Total air superiority vanished. The war turned into a stalemate of asymmetrical combat. On one side stood the Soviet military. They had superior numbers. They had heavy tanks and massed artillery. On the other side stood the Mujahideen. They knew every mountain pass and every cave. They had the support of the local villages. Neither side could deliver a killing blow. The conflict dragged on for 10 years. It became a grinding war of attrition. There was no front line. There was only constant, low-level violence. Who paid the price? The civilian population. Soviet military operations were brutal. Commanders used indiscriminate bombing runs. They leveled entire villages with artillery fire. If a village was suspected of harboring rebels, it was erased. The footage from the era shows the result: craters where homes once stood. The statistics are grim. Hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians died. Millions more fled. They packed their belongings and walked toward the borders. Huge refugee camps appeared in Pakistan and Iran. The Mujahideen were not silent victims. They fought with equal brutality. Resistance groups carried out their own atrocities. They targeted anyone suspected of collaborating with the Soviets or the puppet government in Kabul. Torture and executions became common tools for both sides. The death of Hafizullah Amin had set the tone. His execution at the start of the invasion was a signal. It showed that Moscow would use any amount of force to maintain control. It proved that the war would be fought without mercy. The Soviet military command faced a harsh reality. Controlling the Afghan landscape was difficult. Controlling the Afghan people was impossible. Thus began a decade of fire. December 1979. The invasion was the easy part. Holding the territory became a nightmare. Soviet generals controlled the asphalt and the concrete of the major cities. They held the main roads and the radio towers. But the countryside belonged to the Mujahideen. The geography was a wall. Insurgents operated from hidden mountain bases at high altitudes. They attacked Soviet convoys, destroyed the lead vehicle, and vanished into the rocks. Soviet tanks could not follow them into the narrow passes. The Red Army was blind in the peaks. Why did the strategy fail? At first glance, a superpower against tribesmen. But in reality, a high-tech army fighting a ghost. The Kremlin responded with raw numbers. More divisions arrived. More hardware crossed the border. Bombing campaigns intensified until the valleys shook. Sukhoi jets dropped unguided bombs on any village suspected of harboring rebels. They burned crops and killed livestock to starve the resistance. The footage shows columns of armored vehicles moving through mountain passes. The sound of heavy machine guns echoes against stone. Soviet infantry conducted massive sweep operations. They cleared one valley, then moved to the next. But this was only the beginning of the disaster. The strategy never reached a decisive point. The insurgents adapted. When the Soviets used heavy armor, the rebels used mines. When the Soviets used helicopters, the rebels moved at night. Every tactical shift by Moscow was met by a counter-move in the mountains. The conflict turned into a grinding machine. It got worse. By the mid-1980s, the cost became visible. This was the Soviet Vietnam. The United States had already learned this lesson in the jungles of Southeast Asia. You cannot win a war against a hostile population in impossible terrain. Now, the Soviet Union was trapped in the same loop. The war was a financial black hole. Rubles meant for factories, and food were spent on fuel and ammunition. Resources bled out of the state budget every hour. The economy began to stall. There was no mistake. The political price was higher than the money. The camera records, zinc coffins arriving at secret airfields at night. Soviet society slowly learned the truth about the casualties. The official silence broke. People began to ask why their sons were dying for distant hills. The Soviet media tried to control the narrative. At first, they called it a limited contingent. They described it as a necessary intervention to protect a friendly government. They blamed foreign interference for the chaos. But the reality on the ground was different. The war had become a trap,